Creative Mornings ATL, how are we doing? It's so good to see you all this morning virtually, but thank you all for joining us. I am Joan Lyric Leslie, spoken word poet out of Atlanta, Georgia. And if you are joining us for the very first time, welcome. I want you to go to the chat and throw a number 1 in there so we know who we have with us. For some of our vets, welcome back. We are so happy to have you with us again. And if you all are anything like me, you start every morning with a cup of Joe. And as you know, Creative Mornings partners with a local coffee shop here in Atlanta every month for our series. And this month, we've partnered with Spiller Coffee out in Ponce City Market. So if you haven't already gotten your free cup of coffee and pastry from them, you can head over and let them know Creative Mornings sent you before noon today. Feel free to put it on my tab. Creative Mornings is a free lecture series that happens once a month, and there are over 200 chapters all over the world full of creative people just like you and me. Creative Mornings isn't just happening in Atlanta, it's happening in cities everywhere, all focusing on the same theme. Shout out to our Creative Mornings ATL team that makes this event, our social media, newsletter, and our field trips happen every month. They are the true rock stars that make this all come together. This month's theme is release. Over the past 2 years or so, we've all been experiencing a whirlwind of emotions, and we really want our community to focus on releasing. Release is a universal law. Every buildup of tension must give way. Everything from the flowers to the trees needs it to survive. Release is a critical part of all of our growth, healing, and transformation. We can release each other from our claims. We can be the means for each other's deliverance. It's what gives the words, "I release you," their power. What happens when we let go of these emotions, expectations, habits, relationships, or thoughts that no longer serve us? What do we release in ourselves? What do we let loose into the world? We want to thank our global partners for focusing on this mission with us this month. Creative Mornings is also a super fan of MailChimp's new insider community, MailChimp & Co. Have you heard of it? If you're a freelancer or an agency that helps clients with email marketing and communication, it could be just the right thing for you to look into. Joining will allow you access to insider benefits like exclusive tips and training, insider events, and a first look at new features. Take a peek at MailChimp.com/&co. That's MailChimp.com/&co. It's free and easy to sign up. You can learn more at MailChimp.com/&co, and it's key in the chat for you. Thank you to Skillshare also, our global partner for online learning. Skillshare is an online learning community helping millions to take the next step on their creative journey. Jonathan Van West is here to help you unlock your most centered and powerful self. Skillshare and Jonathan have created an actionable, inspiring class where you can create your own self-care playbook, a set of simple, practical tools to tune into your needs, release your fears, and show up as your very best version of you. You can take the class for free with 1 week free trial of Skillshare at Skillshare.com. You can take the class for free. Like I said, the link will be in the chat. Shout out to Off the Record. We'd like to thank our video partner, Off the Record, a Latina-owned organization that is the farmers market of organic content creation. We're able to stream to you today because of the magic of this team. Be sure to follow them on Instagram at OTR Creative and check out www.offtherecord.com. Today's performance is coming to you by the group Windlow. They are an alt-pop duo from here, Atlanta, by way of Anchorage, Alaska. The duo is comprised of husband and wife, Jacob and Chelsea Hamilton. Windlow, a palindrome of old, new, draw inspiration from many styles and eras in the music ethos, but continually return to their love for light harmonies and pop sensibilities. Welcome, Windlow.
desperate enough to beg. Got me working so hard for your love, fascinating me, turning me on. Come me closer, I can't get enough. I get lost just thinking of us. Only mystery I'm trying to solve. Tunnel vision, you're all that I want. Let me feel your heavenly touch, taking me up to a whole nother world. And I watch your eyes wander, take me where you go. I wanna know things only a lover knows. I can feel the distance, even when you're close. If you want me, baby, you don't let it show. Got me working so hard for your love, fascinating me, turning me on. Call me closer, I can't get enough. I get lost just thinking of us. Only mystery I'm trying to solve. Tunnel vision, you're all that I want. Let me feel your heavenly touch, taking me up to a whole nother world. Let me be a shadow. Oh, just let me be a shadow. And let me be a shadow. Just let me be a shadow. Got me working so hard for your love, fascinating me, turning me on. Call me closer, I can't get enough. I get lost just thinking of us. Only mystery I'm trying to solve. Tunnel vision, you're all that I want. Let me feel your heavenly touch, taking me up to a whole nother world. Let me be your shadow, take me where you go. I wanna know things only a lover knows.
Well, good morning to everyone out there. I would say after a year of doing these kinds of things online, not that we do a lot of them, but it has become a little bit less strange to play to a camera with no applause and no audience. But, you know, it's
We're
still
getting
different.
used to it.
It's still different. Anyway, we are, as Lyric said, we are Wendlow. My name is Jacob. This is my wife, Chelsea. And we're going to keep playing a couple more songs for you this morning. Hope you're having a beautiful and creative morning out there wherever you are. This is a song by one of our favorite songwriters, maybe one of yours, John Mayer.
I'm the boy in your other phone, lighting up inside your drawing home, all alone, pushing 40 in the friend zone. We talk and then you walk away every day. Oh, you don't think twice about me. And maybe you're right to doubt me, but if you give me just one night, you're gonna see me in a new light. Yeah, if you give me just one night to meet you underneath the moonlight. Oh, I wanna take you, I wanna break through, I wanna with all this? What do I do with all this love that's running through my veins for you? What do I do with all this? What do I do with all this love that's running through my veins for you? What do I do with all this? What do I do with all this love that's running through my veins?
2, 3, 4. Thank you.
This next song and our last song is called Downtown. It's another one of our songs. It's about being from a small place, Alaska, and moving to Atlanta. Very different places, if you've ever wondered.
And I used to know what you wanted. A pretty face and bright blue rooms. And I'd have a seat on the staircase. You'd wash the dishes and hum this tune. Downtown, where the dreams that we made are still up for debate. Downtown, every scene and night coming straight from my mind. Downtown, where the dreams that we made are still up for debate. Downtown, every scene and night coming straight from my mind. And I've had this feeling for a while, the kind of try but can't ignore. I know we said and we meant it, but then the love became the chore. Downtown, where the dreams that we made are still up for debate. Downtown, every scene and night coming straight from my mind. Downtown, where the dreams that we made are still up for debate. Downtown, every scene and night coming straight from my mind. When you're up at night, are you thinking of me? While I'm in bed, planning your life away. And when you're up at night, are you thinking of me? While I'm in bed, dreaming your life away. Downtown, where the dreams that we made are still up for debate. Downtown, every scene and night coming straight from my mind. Downtown, where the dreams that we made are still up for debate. Downtown, every scene and night coming straight from my mind.
Thank you all so much. And have a great rest of your creative morning experience with us.
Music. Also check the chat for all the information. It's winlowmusic.com. And on Instagram again, winlowmusic. I just want to say I was a little bit over here. Remember Winlow was playing the head bob and the stank face. I don't know if anybody saw that, but they were amazing. Give it up one more time for Winlow, everybody. All right. At this point in time, I want to thank our local partners. We'd like to thank our local partner, Gene Kansas, Commercial Real Estate, and Constellations. As cultural developers, GK and CRE have garnered a reputation as champions of historic preservation, adaptive reuse, community building, and storytelling through the built environment. If you're looking for a workspace for you or your team, check out Constellations. We also like to thank Indie Studios, where we're streaming right now. Indie Studio, where we're streaming live right now. Indie is an award-winning, design-focused, culturally based workspace now open in Ammar Otley Loop at 190 Otley Drive. Also, this is a point of information that you want to know. Indie is looking for vendors for Indie After Dark on September 30th. If you are an artisan or merchant, reach out to the Indie or for vendor opportunities through email, or you can DM them on Instagram. And then all this information, again, will be in the chat. Let's talk about next month. Our theme for next month, ladies and gentlemen, our theme will be Dare. Make sure you save the date for our next month's theme is Dare, will be September 24th. And at this point, we'd like to talk about our field trip. All right. Field Trip, the largest independent book festival in the country, is headquartered in our hometown. The HAC Decatur Book Festival mission is to bring world-class authors and book lovers together to encourage a love of reading, inquiry, and conversation to people of all ages and build the enthusiastic and inclusive community of readers and writers throughout the South, sparking social, creative, and intellectual engagement. This year's festival takes place on October 2nd. Join us for a conversation with Darren Wang and Rosemary M. McGee to preview this year's lineup and learn about the pivot the festival took along with many arts organizations. Find out what inspired the festival's start and where it's headed in the future. Darren is the founder and former executive director of DBF. He had a 20-year career as a public radio producer and journalist. He is also the author of the novel, The Hidden Light of Northern Fires. Rosemary M. McGee is currently the executive director of the 2021 Decatur Book Festival and director of its Strategic Directions Committee. She serves as the director of Emory Manuscript Archives Rare Book Library. And we also like to shout out Julia Levy, our field trip captain. Shout out to Julia. At this point in time, we'd like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker this month is Doug B. Ammar, executive director of Georgia Justice Project. Douglas, we got formal real quick. Douglas B. Ammar has been an active presence at Georgia Justice Project since its beginning in 1986, starting as a volunteer, then joining the staff as staff attorney in 1990. Doug has led GJP as executive director since '95. GJP has sought to be advocates for our clients, not only by advocating holistic criminal defense and social services, but also seeking systematic change in Georgia law that will reduce the number of people under correctional control and reduce the barriers of reentry. During his time as executive director, GJP has helped change 21 laws in Georgia that have worked to reduce barriers to reentry for people impacted by the criminal justice system. GJP has continued to grow and expand its capacity to serve its clients with support from local founders and national funders who have acknowledged our work. In 2020, GJP assisted over 6,000 Georgians with criminal justice issues and received a $5 million capacity from the Condendon Fund, a national fundraiser based in Atlanta. Welcome to Creative Morning Stage, Doug Ammar.
A great challenge to talk about the issue of release with regard to not only our work. So what I'd like to do this morning is to really do two things. First is to expand the notion of what being released is with regard to the criminal justice system, and then talk about our work at the Georgia Justice Project as it relates to that notion. So most of you are probably thinking the release idea when it comes to criminal justice is being released from jail or prison. Once you're arrested and you either go to jail, which you are go to jail when you're arrested, or when you go to prison and being released from there. And that's true. I mean, that is a sense of release. But today I want to really expand that notion and talk about it in two other ways and give you some data around Georgia and some mechanics about how the system works with regard to being released. So the next slide here shows in Georgia the raw number of people who are currently incarcerated. Incarceration talks about people who are in jail and prison. And that number in Georgia is about 90,000 people. And so the slide, you see that a bar graph with 90,000. But on the right, you'll see our interpretation of the system, we call it the arc of justice, to show from anywhere from policing all the way through reentry is to where these numbers show up. So with regard to the folks who are in jail and prison in Georgia, it starts with the police in that red, and it continues if folks are convicted and go to prison in the yellow. And so the next slide starts to give you some data that gets even more scary. That in Georgia, this shows the Georgia just incarceration number in reference to the United States and in reference to a handful of other countries. This number is per capita. When we talk about numbers in criminal justice, you're always talking about per capita. And many of you probably know that America leads the world in incarceration. We are the world's leader. We have 5% of the world's population, but we have 25% of those who are incarcerated. And that represents the US there. So you see Georgia in reference to the United States, we far outpace the world's leader in incarceration. And you can see our Western country allies, if you will, and their incarceration rates. So you're starting to get the picture. This is not a good picture for Georgia. And the next slide really brings up another key part we always need to talk about, and that's the racial disparities in the system. And this slide shows just for Georgia, for those who are incarcerated, the relationship between the raw population in Georgia and the folks who are incarcerated. So most importantly here is that Georgia has roughly 56% of our population is white, but yet that white population only represents 33% of those who are incarcerated. The exact inverse happens for folks who are African American, that we have about 31% of the population in Georgia that are African American, yet they represent 58% of folks who are incarcerated in jail or prison. This disparity and the disparities in the criminal justice system are replete. They're throughout the system, but this is just the beginning to give you a sense of that 90,000 of how the disparity shows up. So the next slide, I want to expand your notion of what it means to be released, or how the criminal justice system holds people, grabs people. And you'll get the sense of what I'm getting at here is that the system kind of, once it holds you, it kind of keeps you. So most people in the criminal justice system don't stop with people who are incarcerated to talk about the impact. They talk about correctional control. And correctional control adds not just jail and prison, but probation and parole. And so this graph shows you that in Georgia, though 90,000 people are incarcerated, if you add probation and parole, you get up to 527,000 people in Georgia. And on the right, you get a sense of how they show up in the system. But the most important data point here is that Georgia is the country's leader for those under correctional control. We have more people in jail, prison, probation, and parole than any other state in the country, by far. And the next graph will sort of unfortunately show you this in stark detail. We actually call this a scary bar graph. It shows every state in the country with their per capita numbers of correctional control, and compared to every state and the U.S., of course, in the middle. But here's the really telling part about this. If you look at this graph, if you can see it well enough, and again, we can send all this information to you, you'll see that the reason Georgia is so far in front is really because of that orange part of the graph. That orange bar is probation, and it's really felony probation. This is why Georgia is the country's leader by far for having people under correctional control. And I should say that being under correctional control creates a high likelihood of somebody going back to prison or back to jail. So it's not just that you're reporting or paying money to the system. Your freedom is at risk every day. So I want to move on and also, again, point out to the next slide about the racial disparities just with regard to probation in Georgia. That we picked a handful of counties, including Fulton County, where we're sitting right now, to show the percent of the population that's African American and the percent of population of African American folks on felony probation. And throughout the state, again, a massive disparity exists. For those of us who are familiar, you're not surprised, but we should be very ashamed of these numbers, and it should cause concern. So I want to shift now to the third bucket, and that is if you're not just talking about people who are incarcerated, but people who are on probation or parole, I'm going to talk about criminal records. And this first bar chart shows you 90,000 folks who are in jail or prison, 500,000 folks roughly who are under correctional control. But in Georgia, 4.3 million people, 40% of the Georgia population, have a criminal record. When I say a criminal record, I'm talking about folks who have just been arrested, you don't have to be convicted, and or convicted. If you get arrested, you get fingerprinted, and by federal law and state law, that data is kept by the system, and there is a record of you being arrested, and that can impact your life. So I want to talk about that, but when we talk about being released from the system, we also really focus a lot on this issue of how the system, once it's got you, continues to hold you by having a permanent record of your arrest or conviction. The next slide just gives you a perspective for the country. This is not just a Georgia issue. Almost a third of the population, somewhere between 25 and 30% of the U.S. population have been arrested or convicted, as compared to 40% in Georgia. So this is not a small matter. This isn't a small population we're talking about. And this next slide I'd like to point out is you say, well, okay, having a criminal record, so what? Having a criminal record impacts folks in a variety of ways, and most importantly around employment. And that's what we see in our many, many years of work. But it can affect housing, obviously immigration, education, benefits. But employment is the real driver for this, because if we want to care about folks not going back into the system, we really should be focused on employment. Employment is almost like the antidote to folks recidivating. Yet, in this country, we have 50,000 laws, about 1,000 per state. Georgia has 1,006 laws, 1,000 laws in this state that negatively impact, punish people for having a criminal record. And the vast majority of those laws, 60 to 70%, and this is a study by the American Bar Association, is related to employment. And again, there's a mass racial disparity here. If you're a person of color and you have a record, you have a much greater chance of not getting a job than a white person with a record. So the disparities continue even in employment. So, and what lawyers call this area collateral consequences, not the original consequence, but a collateral consequence of someone who has been arrested or convicted. So that just hopefully frames the issue for the moment. You say, okay, release. I'd love for you all to think about release not just being jail or prison. That's just the beginning, but the system continues on as those numbers show. So let me just dive into our work a little bit and tell you about what we're doing at the Georgia Justice Project to sort of intervene, intersect, and disrupt that momentum, if you will. So I appreciate David's introduction. We've been around for 35 years, and we have about 30 staff. We have clients of about 1,000 folks a year, but we actually do, as David said, work with over 6,000 folks every year. And we have a ton of volunteer lawyers, on average, about anywhere from 150 to 300 lawyers who work with us. But I want to also mention a few individuals, cases, if you will, to give you a sense of what our work looks like. I want to talk about Ron, who was arrested for killing his uncle. And I want to talk about Shonda, who was arrested for selling meth. And I want to talk about Joan, who was arrested for killing her husband. Now let me dive into our work a little bit. What do we do about the issue of incarceration? The biggest thing we do on incarceration and our longest serving work is holistic criminal defense, representing people free of charge on criminal matters like a public defender, but we're non-government and we don't totally independent. But we follow our clients, like in this arc, all the way through the system, meaning we don't just represent them in the front end, follow them in the prison, and help when they get out. But what about Ron? You see, Ron was actually was arrested for killing his uncle because his uncle, who he lived with, had been abusing him since he was a kid. And the day that the incident happened, the uncle had pulled out a knife and threatened Ron. And so when we went to court, you say, well, what does that look like? What does our work look like with regard to Ron? Well, for Ron, it looks like a 3-inch red binder. And that 3-inch red binder is what we put together over a number of years and brought it into the prosecutor's office. And then in that binder were records of the 63 arrests that his uncle had, mostly for violence upon his own family. In that binder was the transcript of Ron calling the police as soon as he pulled the trigger and fired one shot and laid his gun down and asked the police to come and asked the ambulance to come to help save his uncle. And in that case, we were able to convince the prosecutor that the right outcome was not to prosecute Ron, is to let the case go, and that case was dismissed. So that's one of the ways we show up with regard to keeping folks from being incarcerated. Now, the next slide really talks more about this holistic approach, our long-term approach, staying with our folks. We have social workers on our team that do an assessment of everybody we work with before we take them on as clients and stay with our clients long-term and their families. And this picture, if you will, we do 2 events a year that bring our clients and their families back together. It's been a bit awkward with COVID, but we still have tried. Actually, you can see, this is one of our COVID events. We do a back-to-school event every year, as well as a holiday/Christmas event to really help support our clients' families. So what we're really trying to do is build community and stay with our clients, not just in prison, and of course, not just in court, but long afterwards. So let me shift, and let me mention one more thing about restorative justice. Another initiative we're working on is to try to reduce the number of people who are being arrested, charged, and convicted. And our office is a big believer in restorative justice, and we have an initiative with hopes that we can launch a restorative justice center here in Atlanta so that prosecutors and judges and even police have another path than just either arresting, charging, and convicting someone, but really bringing the victim and the person who's charged together to create a healing opportunity. So let me shift now to talk about correctional control, the second bucket. Again, not just going from incarceration to who's under correctional control. And here I want to talk about Shonda. So Shonda was arrested for selling meth, but Shonda was no drug kingpin. She was an 18-year-old user. She had enough drugs that she was selling to support her habit. And she was looking at a massive amount of prison time, So when we got involved in the case, our goal was to get her into treatment, not jail, not prison. It took a while, the better part of 2 years, but we were able to convince the judge and a prosecutor that to think about Shonda in a 3-dimensional way, not just punishment, but think about her. Who is she? How did she get here? What are her needs? And how do we stop this from happening again? And we were able to do that and really achieve an outcome that is that she's been in treatment now for over 2 years and is doing well. But that's the kind of intervention we like to work on as part of our work. Now let me shift a moment to talk about some of our policy work in this area around correctional control. And one of our biggest wins actually just happened this year is a bill, we just call it SB 105. And if you go back to that big bar chart, the scary chart with the orange part, you'll remember that Georgia has the largest number of people on probation in the country. And the question is, how do we reduce that bar chart down? So this bill that we got through that went into effect in May of this year aggressively attacks that issue. and allows people, the almost 200,000 people in this slide who are on felony probation, it creates a direct path for them to get off probation if they haven't gotten in trouble for 3 years. And so, the nice part about this bill is it's almost automatic in the sense of the Department of Probation, Department of Community Supervision, files the paperwork. When they recognize someone has done well, they put the paperwork right in front of a judge, and then they ask a judge to let someone off probation. In another case, we just got the word yesterday, one of our clients, after being on probation for 15 years, or originally for 15 years, we were able to cut his sentence down, and he just got off probation yesterday after we intervened with him after 10 years. And this bill has a big impact. It affects about 50,000 people in Georgia, and it will save the state. The estimates are about $34,000 in supervision costs. And lastly, with regard to correctional control, let me just mention our work at the, what we call it MRF. It's a new prison in Georgia, the Metro Reentry Facility, right off Moreland Avenue. And this prison is solely focused on reentry, which is, I'll say, is a bit unusual for the Department of Corrections to focus on reentry. They started 3 years ago. We've been out there for 3 years. And our team of about 4 lawyers and one of our social workers have been out there helping remove barriers to reentry before people get out of prison. It's a pretty novel approach, and it's fascinating work. It's also leading us to sort of some significant policy work, particularly around suspended driver's license and probation reform. It's been amazing work that we hope that we can translate the 200 plus people we work with last fiscal year in that arena into some policy changes that will affect thousands throughout Georgia. All right, so lastly, let me talk about reentry. And this actually is the biggest part of what our organization does these days, and that's criminal record work. So let me talk about Joan. I mentioned Joan killed her husband, and she killed her husband because he had been abusive, and when she pulled the trigger and killed him the day she did, she was afraid for her life. Now, unfortunately, we were not around to represent Joan in her criminal case to keep her from going to prison unfairly, but we did get to know her after prison. And after prison, she came to us because she wanted to get a better job. And when I think about what our work looks like for Joan, it's actually a blue smock. Because when I saw her not terribly long ago, she was wearing this blue smock. And she came to the office, and she was so proud of it, and she kept tapping her left shoulder where this insignia in the blue smock was. And there was an event, and I finally got to talk to her, and I asked her, what's going on? She's touching this insignia on her blue smock. And it turns out that when she she was arrested, convicted, got out of prison, but she couldn't get the job she always wanted to. She wanted to be a dental hygienist, and her criminal record was stopping her from doing that. She came to us. Our lawyers aggressively worked on her case and were able to get an expungement. And that day she was in the office, she was so proud because of that expungement, she was able to have the job she'd always dreamed of. So that's what our work looks like with regard to expungement, if you will. And expungement, I should say, I know I'm not talking to lawyers per se, it's the idea of just sort of taking your record and not letting it show up every time people like Joan show up for a job interview, every time somebody shows up to rent an apartment or apply for school. So that is sort of hiding it or expunging it, removing it from public access. And one of our big victories, and I'm glad David mentioned, it was last year as well, in 2020, a bill that this slide talks about, we call it SB 288, that is pretty aggressive because for the first time in Georgia history, we have an ability to take a conviction and have it fall off someone's record. And this bill, again, went into effect in January of this year. It was signed last June in 2020. That bill affects at a minimum 1.5 million Georgians who now have an access and ability to go in front of a judge and say, listen, I'm not who I was. I've been rehabilitated. Let this record not stop me for the rest of my life. And of the thousands of people we see and work with every year, so many people have an old record. So many people have a record when it's 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and it still impedes their ability to get housing, to volunteer with their kids' school, to get a job. So this ability to get things off your record is one of our big victories, and we continue to push. But we're very excited about how this bill is playing out. And one of the ways we show up in the next slide, just to give you a perspective, and those of you who are saying, well, how do I send people to get some help, or how does that really show up in the world? I would just point out a couple things. I would point out that every month we have something called First Friday. We've been doing it virtually with the pandemic, but we did it in person. And we do a lot of those First Fridays around at other nonprofits and communities all over the state. But the idea of First Friday is that you can sign up and say, I have a record, or I'm working with people who have a record. How do I get this off? How do I change this? Can I get any relief? Or can I get that job in spite of my record? So our lawyers and social workers, we staff that up every month, and it's an access point for folks to get information, and as well as for us to take cases. But I will say one of the really cool things we're doing these days is only 8 weeks old, is the Cobb County Second Chance Desk, really an expungement desk inside a courthouse. First one in Georgia. It's a dream we've had for a long time. And because of this bill I mentioned, there's a willingness, if you will, from the system, prosecutors, judges, clerks, to say, okay, how do we make this available to the community? And so this effort in the Cobb Second Chance Desk, we do it every Friday. As I'm speaking, 3 of our staff are up in the Cobb County Courthouse, helping people work through their records and get expungement. But it's a beautiful thing. I could talk about it forever. But one of the reasons this works so well is it's in partnership with the system. And we are able to move somebody's expungement, if you will, from a matter of weeks or months to days and hours. And we already have gotten a recent grant. We are going to expand this idea, this expungement desk idea, into other jurisdictions in the state. And lastly, I'll say we have a number of expungement summits. We just did one 2 weeks ago here in Fulton County with the Fulton County DA's office in person at the Fulton County Government Building. So we help governments around the state, mainly prosecutors, who want to offer this kind of relief for folks in their community. So with that, I'll really wind up here and hope that we have some questions, but this last slide, if you will, is just talking about our theory of change and how we work. And just to reiterate that we do direct service, but direct service really informs our policy work and our community engagement work as well. And we're always about trying to reduce the number of folks under correctional control and to reduce the number of barriers that folks have who are reentering society. So with that, I'll look to David and see if we have some questions.
Appreciate that. We actually do have a few questions. First question we'd like to ask is, how can the creative community partner with the Georgia Justice Project?
Well, lawyers are not creatives. I'm not saying that. It's terrible. Of course there's some lawyers, but we are typically not. I mean, my staff will tell you. I am, we need people who are creative because, the world of law needs that kind of energy. You can see by the information I presented and the ways we're trying to tell both the stories factually, narratively. We need help all kinds of ways, from graphic artists to storytellers to folks who can help us. We are more and more doing videos of our clients, trying to tell the stories of our clients and trying to tell the stories of these issues. We could use all kinds of help. So please contact us. And this last slide, by the way, the ways you can support, has a number of contact points to get in touch with us.
Okay. That kind of leads to the second question.
Oh,
no, this is awesome. The second question is, we obviously have an audience of storytellers. How does storytelling play a role in pursuing justice at the GJP?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, let me say this. I'm not just me, but most people will tell you that you can't. If you're trying to convince somebody, I don't care who the person is, legislator, business person, average person, whomever, that there needs to be a change, you really can't rely on only one leg of the stool. You can't. You can't just rely on data. You can't say, listen, this is going to make sense. You can't just rely on a fiscal argument, important, especially in states like Georgia, to say this will save money, et cetera, et cetera. But you also need to be able to tell the story and bring in the stories of our clients, especially into the legislature, into the rooms of those with power and those who have influence, is the way you can change hearts and minds. So my feeling is you always have to operate on a number of tiers to get people listening and hopefully leaning in to the change that we're all trying to seek. And so helping us tell those stories is huge, is one of those legs of the stool.
Awesome. Love the answer. Another question: how can entrepreneurs create more opportunities for folks who may have a record?
That's a big question. I mean, I talk to folks. I mean, this issue of people with records and getting jobs, and I think of entrepreneurs as creating jobs. One of the biggest things that we like to do is I call them dispel the urban myths about people with criminal records. A lot of folks think whether it's a small business or a big business, whatever kind of power and control they have in hiring people, they think, oh, well, we would never hire somebody with a fill in the blank. And so we put out a lot of data, and I'll tell you a couple quick points. If you're in that position of hiring people or considering launching a business and you say, well, who are we going to fill these spots? The data suggests a couple of things. One, people with a record are more loyal, are more reliable, have a higher retention rate, lower turnover rate than people without a record. Big studies, and include as big as 1 million people, have confirmed that from folks who've studied this at Harvard. So one is that this isn't a risky population. Secondly, I would say even one of those bills we just talked about that we got passed last year, SB 288, has provisions for liability protection for employers that hire. So if you're worried about hiring, I would say don't worry, one. I mean, think, open your mind up a little bit, because it's going to help you financially, and they're going to be good employees. That's maybe one of my first responses, David.
All right, a few more questions. Sure. What should I do if my family member has been wrongfully incarcerated?
Well, okay. So we're here for the next, 3 hours? Okay, I mean, come on. This is a big deal. I mean, the system is massive, and the prison system, if you saw the number, about 54,000 people in prison. I mean, I've spent most of the last 31 years in court. I was in court yesterday watching. It's so easy. It's so easy to get convicted, and it's so easy to get incarcerated, and it's really, really hard to get out. Unfortunately, in Georgia, there aren't too many groups who are there to help. I mean, if somebody's wrongfully convicted, I mean, one of the main groups out there, of course, everybody knows the Innocence Project, but they're only based, and I love them, they're friends all over the country, but they only work on DNA evidence or scientific evidence. Can we prove through a scientific fact that this person is innocent? And that's great, but it affects a small percentage of those 54,000 people. There are one of the best ways, I think, is sometimes you get somebody in the family gets involved too late in the case, so that the real remedy is actually the parole system, the pardon and parole system. And families and communities can have a big difference with regard to helping somebody get parole. Now, that isn't getting exonerated, but it is getting them out of prison. There's also a movement, I will say this too, Georgia has its first conviction integrity unit inside a DA's office, a district attorney's office in Fulton County. More and more counties are talking about that. So even prosecutors are developing mechanisms, and the woman who runs it for Fulton is a friend of mine, and we go back many years, but they are developing processes so they can get people out of prison who are wrongfully convicted. So that's really pretty amazing. We've seen more and more DAs, prosecutors around the state, who folks have been in prison 10, 20, even 30 years, are saying, wait a second, even if it's not DNA evidence, scientific evidence, is there a just outcome to get this person out? So there are a few methods. I think they're opening up more, and I think as a community, we can put more pressure on the prosecutors, who really hold the keys to the kingdom, and the pardon and parole board.
Final question is actually my question. So I was reading how you had 21 laws changed, and I like to try to inform, trying to inform people. Is there any law that people should be aware of, or law to work on and say, hey, take note of this is happening, or we're working on this?
I don't play softball, but that's an underhanded pitch right there. That's like let's go. So every year we try to really focus on 1 to 3. I mean, we're a small organization, and we can't take on a wide breadth of policy in any one given legislative year. We have 3 focus points this year, and one of them is around. You heard me talk about driver's license. I didn't give you any numbers on that. In Georgia, 200,000 people a year get their driver's license suspended because of debt. And in that prison we work in, basically half the population of that prison have their driver's license suspended because of debt. These are people in prison who have no money, and they can't get their they lost their driver's license because of debt, and now they can't get it back. We've gotten way deep in this issue. That's one area that we're trying to change. We actually have partners like the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and the Metro Chamber of Commerce who are helping us, as well as other companies, because companies see this as a barrier to employment, and it is. So that's one big piece. Second big piece we're working on is occupational licensing. So if you can't get a job sometimes directly, then a lot of folks will go get a nursing certificate or become a barber. All those things have to be licensed by the state. And if you have a criminal record, that is a huge barrier to that. And the law on this, we did get some change 5 years ago, but we have representing folks all over the state who keep getting denied licenses because of even just an arrest, even people who are not guilty. These boards, of which there are many, almost 100 boards in Georgia, they deny folks. And so we got to change that law. And the third thing I would say is always around expungement. We continue to push the idea that if you've been convicted of something in your past, that shouldn't determine your opportunity for the future. And too many times, that's exactly what happens. So one of the things we're trying to do is to keep pushing through to expand the opportunity. So if somebody even is convicted of what most folks would say is a terrible thing or a violent felony, people make mistakes, especially when they're young. And if someone is not that person anymore, they've changed, they've rehabilitated, the system ought to acknowledge that and create a path for them to rejoin society, particularly around employment, because that's going to be the key. So we're trying to expand that. It's one of our big things that we will continue to push around felony convictions for folks in Georgia.
Final question. Oh, yeah. You handle them so wonderfully. This is a real simple question. How can people join First Fridays?
So I think hopefully on this last site, we have you go to our website, there's a sign in for First Fridays. We manage folk. with the pandemic, actually, we used to limit it to 30 or 40 people. We have a space in our building we could handle. Now we have folks coming from all over the state virtually, and I think there's less of a limit. But we also want to be able to talk to people one-on-one and use our volunteer lawyers as well. So if you go to our website, I should know exactly, but if you type in First Friday at our website or First Friday Georgia, there's a sign up. There's also a number you can call if you want to just call the number and say, get me on the list. We do have it's not open, we only open up for 500 people at any one time, but we do create spots and there's ways to do it.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
The information you had. Thank you, Creative Mornings family. Appreciate you guys. Give up more time for Winlow for performing. And everybody have a safe and wonderful weekend. Thank you.